unleash the full power of the federal government in this effort today, I am officially declaring a national emergency.
This is a global pandemic. This is something the United States wants to work with every country, including China.
This is not a short-term situation. This is not a long weekend.
There have been many names given to the phenomenon that has flipped our world completely upside down just in the past month.
The coronavirus is
COVID-19.
Wuhan virus.
The virus for Chinese virus.
the coronavirus.
The name of the virus that has led to this global pandemic is the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. COVID-19 is the name for the contagious respiratory disease associated with the virus.
The earliest reported case was on November 17, 2019, in Wuhan, China, from where the outbreak quickly spread to South Korea, Japan, and the United States in 3 weeks.
As of May 28, 2020, there are a reported 5.69 million cases, and there have been approximately 356,000 deaths worldwide. The first reported case in the United States was in Washington on January 17, 2020. The U.S. has quickly become the country with the largest population of those with COVID-19 and the largest death toll, at nearly 100,000 deaths in the nation alone.
But this virus has not only increased fear and anxiety about the health of ourselves and our loved ones. In the few months that COVID-19 has taken over the world, hate crimes and racist sentiments against Asians and Asian Americans have spiked all over the United States.
And there were about 6 Asians. They were all buying in bulk. I'm like, hello, it was your cousins that did this to us.
Every disease that ever came from China, homie. Because I'm disgusting.
And the rest of the world.
You fucking Asian. Yeah! Get the out of me now!
Through this audio documentary, we will explore a number of questions. What is the relationship between COVID-19 and xenophobia against Asians and Asian Americans?
How are Asians and Asian Americans navigating this new, yet familiar, terrain of racial tension and negative bias in the United States?
How have leaders from the federal level to the institutional level responded and or contributed to the recent uptick in hate crimes against Asians and Asian Americans?
And finally, what is ethical representation and how do we practice it?
For this project, Julianna Rennie, Martinez, and myself, Erin Lee, interviewed 6 individuals with different areas of expertise and experience.
My name is Gunther Peck. I teach history and also ethics in the history department and the Sanford School of Public Policy. I'm also the director of the Hart Leadership Program, which is a wonderful place to think about the uses of history and how they help shape systemic change and also leadership, both in the past and in the present. So my interests are particularly focused in immigration history and immigration policy. Although not an immigrant myself, I've long been captivated by the particular political and ethical challenges that immigration has posed to this nation.
I am Alex. I'm from New York. I'm currently back home here. I am a senior currently. I am Asian American.
My name's Annie. I work at a retail pharmacy, so not in the hospital, but like out in the community, like what you would think of like a CVS or like a Kroger, Walmart, that kind of pharmacy. I've been working for now maybe close to 2 years, maybe. I'm Korean American, born in the States in Virginia, and then I grew up kind of like a little bit in Texas, and then a little bit in Korea for middle school and high school. And then for like undergrad and pharmacy school, I was in the States again.
So I'm Chen Chen. That's not my real name. My full name's in Chinese that no one can pronounce, so I just go by Chen Chen. But I am from China. I was born in Shenzhen, but I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, but I also spent a lot of my life going back and forth between Shenzhen and Cleveland and going back and forth between like public schools. And a lot of my family on my mom's side, they're all from Wuhan, so I visit Wuhan every year.
So I'm Freddie. I'm a senior here at Duke. I am no longer in Durham. Back home, I live north of Chicago. Yeah, I'm a biology major, poli-sci major as well. Going to grad school next year. I'm Chinese American. My parents were immigrants from China in the 90s, and yeah, I was born here in the States, born in Georgia.
We also spoke to Dr. David Liu, a visiting scholar in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke.
I was born in Taiwan in the 60s and came to this country as a child immigrant along with my family in the late 70s. About a year before the U.S. severed relations with what was then known as the Republic of China and substituted that relation with PRC, People's Republic of China. And I have been an American since 1983, but I've also lived overseas quite a bit in Japan and Italy and Israel and summers in other countries. And I've been in North Carolina for 20 years since I came for my PhD at Duke. And I've been here since. My disciplines have evolved and crisscrossed over time. I started in neuroscience as an undergraduate at Sanford and switched to music and then pursued theology, later Eastern and Western philosophies in different countries, and have also become more interested in cultural theory, critical media studies, etc.
COVID-19 has affected all of us in incredible ways that we could have never imagined. Together, we process this pandemic, the ensuing xenophobia and hate against Asians and Asian Americans, and what ethical representation means. What ultimately prompted our curiosity about ethical representation was when President Donald Trump decided to call the novel coronavirus the Chinese virus.
I would like to begin by announcing some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus. We'll be invoking the Defense Production Act.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's
China.
racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
About Chinese
Yeah,
Americans
please,
in
John,
this country.
please.
The aides behind you. Are you comfortable with this term?
I have great love.
Soon after, he received a bunch of backlash for his comment and flipped the switch on calling it the Chinese virus, stating that Asians weren't to blame for the coronavirus. But soon after he first used the term, reports of anti-Asian racism and discrimination began to emerge in the media. We asked our interviewees what they thought about President Trump's statements.
Yeah, so I'm definitely aware of the comments that he's made. It's hard to ignore them. But it's been really scary and sad, but also I am personally not that surprised by his statements, which is kind of, I guess, sad that I'm not that surprised. But I think what the coronavirus has done and a lot of the xenophobia that's come about at all the stages of this outbreak has shown, at least me personally, that this kind of like racism and hatred and fear towards Asian people and Chinese people specifically has kind of always existed in this country, but this virus has given people a really, really easy way to target Asian Americans, and I think it's exposed a lot of the hatred that has always been here in this country and has always existed, even in the highest power of the White House. And we just didn't see it because it wasn't advantageous, I guess, for the people who were higher up to kind of make these derogatory statements towards Asian people, because Asian people were like really beneficial to Trump and like in a really messed up way, you know, with like China and like trading and Asian people being seen as the model minority and all those problematic things. But now that the virus has come about, it's a very easy way to put Asian people down. And I think people are really taking advantage of that.
According to a press statement from the Stop AAPI Hate campaign, from March 19th to April 23rd, they had received 1,497 reports of coronavirus-related discrimination against Asian Americans. Since May 13th, there has been nearly 1,700 reports submitted to the campaign. Most incident reports were made from those living in California and New York, but they ultimately came from across 45 states in Washington, D.C. Asian Americans across the country were reporting verbal harassment, shunning, physical assault, workplace discrimination, and a bunch of other types of discrimination. And I could barely believe the kind of things Asians across the country were reporting. For example, one person reported, "Group of people talking saw me. I was wearing a mask. One told everybody to shut up, there's one. They all looked at me and moved away. Made sure I didn't follow them. Kids stared. I smiled and waved. They moved closer to their parents." Another was physically and verbally assaulted. "I was getting in my car after shopping, wearing a mask and gloves. A truck drove by and they threw a drink on my back and yelled, 'Hey, chink, you're f***ing nasty.'" Another was verbally abused as well for speaking their own language. "I was on the phone with my mom speaking in Mandarin when a woman walked by and yelled, 'Get this coronavirus chink away from me,' directed at me." And perhaps one of the most shocking reports that I read, a current graduate student in the Department of Environmental Studies posted, "There's a special place in hell reserved for the Chinese and their archaic culture. Trump's description of COVID-19 as the Chinese virus is the most accurate thing he has ever said. I wish it had wiped the whole country off the planet." She further wrote, "China will learn nothing and will continue to consume wildlife into extinction. What a horrible backwards culture and way of thinking."
Like, people in general kind of see China as somewhere that's like uncivilized, dirty, backwards, or just not open, like a dictatorship, and like people don't have free will. And those are stereotypes that are just like, they're nothing new, you know, but they're just amplified in this crisis.
Yeah.
And it's really disheartening to see, because it's like different nations aren't held up to the same standard. And in terms of talking about China, it's really easy for people to be really attracted by like one idea, like say wet markets. Like, this was one of the things that I felt was really reckless in terms of the media in the U.S., because people are calling for a ban on wet markets. So the thing is, the term wet markets just means farmers market. It comes out of Hong Kong, but they call them wet markets. They're just farmers markets. And people want all wet markets closed. And people see that wet markets are reopening and they're like, oh, well, like China's evil and they're going to keep doing this. But the reality is, wet markets are farmers markets, and that's where 80% of the country gets their food. And most of these markets don't have illegal wildlife. And the ones that do have illegal wildlife for only specifically for customers that are seeking it. Like, it's usually not super obvious, and it's only like really wealthy people who buy it too. The average person in China, no one's really eating these exotic meats except for like the wealthy people, or like a really small minority of China, and also a small minority of wet markets. And like the fact that all these media outlets reported that it originated in this wet market, it just sounds exotic and like dirty and terrible things, but in reality it's just like a place for most ordinary people in China to have affordable fresh food. Chinese bodies and Chinese like thoughts and experiences are so like foreign and exotic and like far away that people just couldn't relate to them. People always repeat these things about how people in China don't have freedom and are like slaves, or like all these like stereotypes, you know, but never ask a Chinese person what they think of it. Different kinds of Chinese people, and also don't even realize how big China is. Like, China is almost the same size as the U.S., including Alaska, and it's just such a large, diverse nation, and people like look at China and all they see is like communism or like stuff.
Of course, most of the animosity caused by the virus has been directed towards Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans. But as often is the case in this country, Americans are not very good at telling the difference between all the types of ethnicities within the Asian diaspora, and violence has been inflicted on people for simply looking Asian. And the media isn't very good at making these differentiations either. I mean, a lot of the articles that I've seen simply refer to an Asian man on a train or an Asian woman outside her home. But those differentiations matter. I mean, here's the thing. Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans should not be subjected to this kind of behavior and abuse in no way, shape, or form. But if Asians of other ethnicities are also being targeted, this is indicative of larger issues of stereotypization, prejudice, and racial bias. Well, on March 14th, it was reported that a man had stabbed members of a Burmese family simply because he thought they were Chinese and spreading the coronavirus. In other news reports, victims were simply identified as Asian. For example, as early as February, a high schooler in California was attacked for being Asian and for possibly having the virus. In April, the media reported that a 51-year-old Asian woman was attacked on a New York bus while her attackers made anti-Asian comments at her. All the issues with the way the media reports these incidents and the lack of general coverage in mainstream media aside, it has been infuriating and agonizing to watch videos and clips of the sort of racism and hate and violence against Asians that's being shared across the internet.
And there were about 6 Asians that one started off by pissing me off, by cutting me off, and then it was just downhill from there. They parked right next to me, they were all around me, they were all buying in bulk. I'm like, hello, it was your cousins that did this to us. So yeah, I will be staying home because I think I have been exposed. But let's be honest, I brought donuts, so.
Hand sanitizer, come here. Sanitize your ass. Come here. Here. You need some. Come here. Hand sanitizer. Every disease that ever came from China, homie. Everything comes from China. It's disgusting. They could be so smart and be like, oh, yeah, I'll develop this, I'll develop that. But like, yeah, you can't even wipe your ass. Under me. Tell them to move. Tell them to move. Move.
What's doubly frustrating is that this sort of behavior against Asians or immigrants is hardly new. Unfortunately, the anger and violence you hear from these audio clips documenting the abuse against Asian bodies, they have a historical precedence. So, through our own research surrounding the relationship between pandemics and immigrants, and our own discussions with historians Dr. Gunther Peck and Dr. David Liu at Duke University, we learned very quickly that xenophobia, violence, and the politicization of Asian bodies has a very long history. Xenophobia against people within the Asian diaspora, and immigrants in general for that matter, and its relationship with the fear of disease is deeply rooted in the United States' own history of immigration.
History can be helpful in one way, which is that there's usually stories, even if they're depressing in a way. There are precedents for this, certainly, and it's not that surprising in one sense to see how people have conflated the fear of a very contagious virus with the fear of foreigners or a fear of the people who might be bringing it to them. And in that sense, the fear of contagion and the fear of people from another place have historically been mutually supporting fears.
For example, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and it effectively banned Chinese immigration to the United States for 10 years. The law was passed in response to quote-unquote dirty Chinese immigrants who many Americans on the nation's West Coast claimed were the cause of the economic hardships they were facing.
So it's a way of linking a pandemic to people of color. That also is not new. And the ways in which, if you study immigration history, particularly history of Chinese immigration or any of the global migrations, that the ways in which immigrants have been conflated with sickness and disease is a really troubling story. And what's hard to separate out is the story of public health. Like public health and hygiene, for example, have a really interesting history, partly rooted in xenophobia. Like that's how public health services got organized. So it's not, if it were as simple as saying, oh, the xenophobes are here and the good doctors were there, be a simpler story in a way. But in fact, public health officials have often been some of the worst, most racist actors in actually giving some credence to the lie that immigrants are to blame for public health problems that, in fact, they have only really they're victims of rather than the causes of.
What Professor Peck is referring to are the immigration restrictions from the early 20th century that barred all sorts of immigrants. Jews, the Irish, Italians, and of course East Asians like the Chinese and Japanese, but South Asians as well. Immigrants were often subjected to dehumanizing medical exams that were conducted even before they arrived on American soil, and then they were subsequently forced into quarantine and additional medical examination. Asian immigrants in particular were often singled out and discriminated against much more harshly than their European counterparts. According to historian Amy Lauren Fairchild, whose work explores public health and public health ethics, from 1904 to 1910, the U.S. Public Health Service recommended rejection rates from 5 to 65% for Japanese and Chinese immigrants, as opposed to the 4 to 6% recommended for immigrants examined in Italy. Connecting immigrants and non-citizens to disease as a sort of scapegoat for what boils down to a poor management of government has been a pattern that has popped up time and time again in history. In the 1920s, immigration restrictions and the fear of contagion justified racial segregation in New York City. During the American colonization of the Philippines, U.S. colonial authorities and public health officials sought to, quote, improve the contaminated, weak, and feeble race, unquote, of Filipinos, whose lands and essentially their bodies they had just colonized. During the Second World War, war propaganda portrayed the Japanese as rats, animals who have long been harbors and spreaders of disease. In the 1980s, unlike their Cuban counterparts who were welcomed with open arms, Haitian immigrants were turned away due to an unprecedented fear that they would spread HIV. Unfortunately, these stories of xenophobia are hardly forgotten moments of the past. As recently as 2003, yellow peril reemerged with the outbreak of SARS, the coronavirus preceding the current virus that causes COVID-19, with an uptick of racial profiling and discrimination against South Asian communities in Canada. Today, we see and hear about the violence and abuse targeted against Asians and Asian Americans in the United States, much of which has been exacerbated by President Donald Trump, who insisted on calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus during multiple press conferences in the early days of COVID-19, has called COVID-19 the China virus in his tweets, and has continued to maintain that China is to blame for the current global pandemic.
I would like to begin by announcing some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus.
What he's done really is, from a purely tactical point of view, very brilliant. He has elided this economic resentment resentment writ large of Chinese ascendancy with the viralization of immigrants, especially from our southern border, right? So before since before his reelection, he's been describing Mexican immigrants and others from that part of the Americas as as a pestilence, as a kind of a plague, right, of crime and disease and so forth. This is a time-honored trope that has a very long history, certainly in this country, starting with African persons that constituted our enslaved population for the most part, and then was shifted onto the Irish in the second half of the 19th century, and to the Italians, and to the Slavs, and to the Jews, and so on and so forth. all in a kind of play of evolution of whiteness and eugenics. I believe he's visited all these topics, but he just shifts all that viralization onto the Chinese. For those of us that are students of history, we need to watch this very carefully for the way that he is manipulating all these pieces.
What history reflects, as Dr. Liu and Dr. Peck have articulated to us, is a distortion of the truth and a lack of transparency. Professor Liu expanded further on the subject as it relates to the representation of Taiwan.
You may not know that that Taiwan is not part of the World Health Organization, and that is a function of Chinese pressure, PRC pressure, on that organization to disallow its membership. So when the outbreak began in China, the government of Taiwan reached out to WHO, even though it was not a member, not even an observing member, for clarification. What's going on? Tell us what you know. It ignored completely, and same thing happened with the International Aviation Agency when Taiwan tried to reach out and clarify, what's going on with aviation, what the restrictions are going to be and protocol, et cetera, to contain the disease. Nothing. What choice did Taiwan have? It simply had to do everything itself, okay, without the help of the international community. And even when it was proving to be amazingly successful in containing this disease, its officials refused to talk about Taiwan at all, because for them, Taiwan does not exist, okay? It must not be represented in the official utterances of the WHO because of Chinese pressure. There was a viral interview done by a Hong Kong journalist, Canadian official of the WHO, was asked about Taiwan and his response. He first pretended he couldn't hear the question. Then he kind of grimaced and disconnected the video interview. And then when he came back, he was asked the same question again, to which his response was, "We've already talked about China. I think all the various regions of China have done pretty well." Well, if you go to compare the infection rate and the death rate of China versus Taiwan, there's a huge difference. I guarantee you there's a huge difference. But for him, because Taiwan must not be represented, all differences in terms of response and efficacy are erased.
Lack of transparency from the government and an unethical representation of the novel coronavirus itself and its possible treatments can also lead to panic and uncertainty.
Okay, so when they first started bringing up the coronavirus, I, as a healthcare worker, I follow news reports from health professionals, like the CDC, immunologists and epidemiologists, people who know what they're talking about, right? And even those people back, even a couple months ago, I would say they weren't necessarily up to date because we just didn't know a lot about this coronavirus period. So for example, the whole mask wearing thing, the CDC just started recommending that people in the general public wear, if they can't find regular masks, wear a cloth mask or a DIY mask. That being said, if our it's been a little bit slow getting information even from trustworthy sources. So when non-health related media posts or the news start talking about things, I don't know, what Trump was saying, we're going to have the country back open by Easter, which is tomorrow. When people say things like that, or even celebrities, when they say things like, oh, this is only going to last a month, or this isn't going to last that long, I think it's very unwise to say that kind of thing because a lot of people who don't understand the science behind things are going to take that to mean that they can just go out and do things and then they'll be spreading germs and not helping the whole situation. And so news coverage, media coverage of the entire issue, it's been very slow, at least in the United States.
And I think it's increasing the amount of panic in our communities.
For example, President Trump's recent statements about hydroxychloroquine had serious consequences.
It's called Plaquenil. The generic name of it is hydroxychloroquine. And I mean, it's a really good drug for like anti-malarial purposes. A lot of people use it for rheumatoid arthritis. But I mean, I know that there are studies being done for its use in the COVID-19, treatment, maybe even prophylaxis, which is prevention of it. But given that it's so new, it's only not even being recommended, but only kind of suggested for critical care patients, because that's kind of the type of patients that they tested it on. That being said, because a lot of our leaders and a lot of the media are like talking about this amazing anti-malarial medication, a lot of doctors are prescribing it as preventative measures for themselves and their family members, which in theory it's a good idea because they're the ones who are being exposed the most. But like I said, the studies have only really looked at critical care patients who really need it. So what this is leading to is I know that my particular pharmacy, we may have trouble getting this medication. I don't know yet. It's just a possibility. Just getting it from our manufacturers. And actually they've put policies in place for us to limit how we dispense this medication, so that the people who actually really need it, the ones with lupus, the ones with rheumatoid arthritis and malaria, like they can actually get the medicine that will save their lives. And we know that it works for them. Another thing with this medication, it has a lot of detrimental side effects. So it affects the heart. Like it can cause something called QT prolongation, which basically just makes your heart not work properly. It can cause a lot of like vision disturbances. There's this whole list of things that it's not good for. So given the fact that we don't have a lot of evidence for it, it has a lot of side effects for it, and a lot of people need it for other things. Like the fact that it's being promoted as a wonder drug is, I think, very, like I said before, unwise. And
since we spoke to Annie in April, a man has died after taking chloroquine phosphate, a chemical used to treat aquariums, and the drug has since been proven to be ineffective in treating COVID-19, only used as a last resort for critical care patients. But then, on April 24th, President Trump suggested the use of using light and disinfectant inside the body, although there had been reports that calls to Centers for Poison Control had increased in the weeks after his statements. American citizens, thankfully, have not taken the president's words too literally. However, such incidents have only articulated that the government has fallen short of its duty to communicate clearly and transparently to its citizens during moments of crisis. Things are still constantly changing in terms of information on the coronavirus and the available solutions being developed. And a lot of citizens are desperate for information that they can trust. In addition to the representation of entire nations and treatments for contagious viruses, unfortunately, Asians and Asian Americans have been suffering under the repercussions of unethical representation for a very long time. The effects of politicizing the coronavirus brings us back to the repercussions of unethical representation. As much as historical events can remind us of yellow peril of years past, many Asians and Asian Americans' own personal experiences reflect the legacy of xenophobia and anti-Asian racism in this country. Being the model minority and existing in this purgatory of what is the black-white racial dichotomy in the United States is incredibly confusing, frustrating, and downright exhausting. Expectations from one's Asian parents notwithstanding, society and the world expects us to be one type of Asian or certain types of Asians. This often cited quote-unquote model minority myth, it comes at the detriment of other minorities, usually black, and it leads to painful conflict among American racial groups. I mean, look at the LA riots in the 90s. It's a perfect example of how society, media, and the authorities have turned Black and Asians against each other. After the LAPD brutally beat Rodney King, Black rioters destroyed much of Koreatown, leading to many Korean Americans to set up their own militias to protect their families and businesses. Not only that, in a society when seeing an Asian face on television is a novelty, the idea of the Asian racial monolith barely highlights the experiences of East Asian Americans and blatantly ignores the experiences of South Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Unique ethnic customs, foods, and cultures are completely obliterated in the face of racism, stereotypization, and discrimination. And being Asian in America is incredibly nuanced, and the discrimination we face lies silent underneath the smallest of interactions.
I've definitely seen in the news, like, people making comments about the Chinese virus, a lot of racial, not just comments, but racial attacks specifically directed towards Asian Americans. And in my personal experience, I have yet to experience like extreme things like this. To be honest, even with the coronavirus happening in my workplace, I have not seen a lot of difference in how people treat me. I still get, even before the coronavirus hit, I got like a lot of comments like, oh, like, where are you from? And if I answer somewhere in the States, they're like, no, where are you really from? Like, I got that comment a lot. I got things like when people were asking for me specifically, they'd say, oh, where's the Oriental girl? People would say things like, oh, konnichiwa, even though that's Japanese and I'm Korean. Like, people would just make assumptions about who I was as a person. But the main thing that I kind of experience, I guess, I think it's called microaggressions. Just like comments here and there, which, again, like a lot of times the person saying them, they mean well. But it's a little bit uncomfortable. Like this one time, there was a shirt that my store was selling, and it had Japanese on the front. My one of my coworkers was like, "Oh, Annie, what does it say?" And I was like, "I can't read that. That's in another language. That's not Korean." So like little things like that, people. I think growing up, a lot of times people would assume like, "Oh, Annie will know it because she's Asian and she'll be smart enough to know it." Like, I've kind of gotten that growing up in school. Part of me didn't know any better and was like, oh, wow, they think I'm smart. But then I guess after having grown up, I was like, well, they're just assuming. Like, I wasn't necessarily super smart. Like, I tried really hard and worked my butt off to get good grades. But like, just for them to think of that automatically, it was a little bit annoying later on once I realized what was happening. I think as a working professional in the healthcare field, it's pretty similar. Like, part of me is flattered that they would think like, oh, like I can use my expertise and share it with them. But like, also I've told them that I'm Korean and not all Asians are the same. Not every Asian that comes to our pharmacy is Korean. So like, part of me is glad that they, like, my coworkers rely on me to communicate to my patients. Like, I do actually talk to a lot of my Korean patients, and I'm able to, you know, with my limited Korean, like tell them about their medicines, answer their questions. So I'm really like thankful that I'm able to speak to Korean speaking patients. Like, I'm really glad I'm able to reach out to them. But for my coworkers to expect me to do that for all Asians is a little bit like, I've told you already, I don't speak those other languages. It's a little frustrating, I guess is the word.
I feel like I've almost never had a time where I felt like my identity was accurately represented. How does it make me feel? I guess it's really easy to, like, as an Asian identifying person, like, to put Asians in a very small box for so long in the media, and it's just changing now, like, literally this past year, I would say, where Asians were only seen as like the stereotypical nerd, or, you know, the ninja, or the submissive woman. So I always felt like I didn't really, either like I wasn't a good Asian because I didn't feel like I fit those molds, or I felt like I was embarrassed of my racial identity because I was like, oh, well, I don't want to be the nerd, or the ninja or the submissive woman. So I'm embarrassed of that. So it made me feel really confused for a really long time, like as a kid, and I'm sure like every person of color thought this as a kid, but like I always wanted to be white because I would like wish for that. It would just be so much easier. I wouldn't need to like every hero is white, like every main character is white. So it would just be a lot easier for me. All my friends are white. I went to a very white high school. So I guess I was like very confused by how the media portrayed people who look like me because I didn't feel like I saw myself represented in any of the characters, and when I did feel close to characters, they were usually white, and I was like, well, I don't look like that, you know?
I think for me, so I'm a male identifying first generation Chinese immigrant. I think a lot of times people assume that as a member of the Asian American community, specifically like as an Asian male, that we've just fit in that like nerdy Asian stereotype, you know.
Freddie also told me and Julianna about the assumptions that people make about him because of his identity. How they always think he's probably a comp-sci major or a bio pre-med and likes to study, when in reality, he doesn't like computer science and he's not pre-med. And he's actually really into basketball and hip-hop, and how that's always so surprising to people. How in this period where Asian Americans are seemingly not very politically active, that they're typecasted as being quiet, studious, hard workers, and they don't make a scene. And people just assume that their assumptions are valid because, oh yeah, Asians, they don't fight people, they don't do anything. He also told us, quote, I was born in a very white area, Gwinnett County in Georgia, and I moved around a bunch of other places that were very predominantly white. And it's definitely interesting to be the only Asian kid in the school because you kind of initially take on the role of the Asian stereotype and take it as a joke. But after a while, you realize that people were making fun of who you are. I personally definitely feel like I've washed myself a lot in order to fit in. Freddie also added that it was interesting to see how he had to go through a change of identity to feel like who he really was. I personally sympathize very deeply with these stories. I mean, like, what does it really mean to be Asian American? Like, of course, I know I can be whatever I want. I mean, I'm American, right? But, like, can I really just be whatever I want? I mean, even in working on this audio documentary, embedding my own personal experiences, frustration, and trauma into this project, I find myself trying to be very careful with my words. You know, be less harsh, less opinionated, less aggressive. Even in trying to figure out what ethical representation means and is, I'm stopping myself from ethically representing who I am. I mean, I was told all of my life that I was too loud and too angry. In school, I was told by a teacher that I was a bad Asian because I wasn't good at physics and I talked too much. When Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, I remember being asked to keep my head down and be careful about what I said in public because of my strong opinions. In college, I lived with this constant internal struggle of my own privilege as an East Asian person and the disadvantages of other minorities, you know, often undermining my own experiences and that of other Asians. It wasn't until COVID-19 that I was shocked back into remembering that racism against Asians is still alive and well, and it hurts people that look like me every day. What these stories articulate is that AAPIs have been excluded from American society and have been forced to assimilate for a very long time. The smallest of comments and side glances make it clear that we don't belong in this country. The recent uptick in hate crimes and xenophobia against Asians and Asian Americans simply bring this invisibility and lack of representation to light. In 1974, writer Frank Chin said, "Whites love us because we're not black. Our bodies and our cultures have been used to justify white supremacy and racist politics whenever it has served the racial majority. In years past, racist structures in society used Asian American quote-unquote success as justification for blaming Black people regarding racial disparities in this country. Today, during the coronavirus pandemic, yellow skin and small eyes are better served as a political weapon against China in a global trade war. But is there hope? I couldn't help but reflect back in one of our own interviews, my own personal fears for my community in the coming election and the aftermath of this pandemic. Surprisingly, I received a much more helpful answer than I expected.
Okay, I saw a tweet the other day where it was like, it is so hurtful to see how we can go from like having a Korean language film win an Oscar, like just destroy at the Oscars, and then the minute this virus comes around, like the world just like flips the switch on us. And like, you know, it was like almost like we were starting to have Asians like kind of step in and like be seen, you know, like with The Farewell and Parasite and Andrew Yang. Like, this is totally speculative, but what do you think about the future of like maybe Asian civic engagement for activism or our place in society now that this pandemic is happening? It's a bit of a grim question, but I'm curious what you think.
It's a totally valid question, though. I think, so, what I think I've learned from the political science and thinking about it is that, like, I always take my first thought, like my gut reaction, and go the opposite direction, because that's usually how things happen. So my gut reaction was that, like, there would be this, like, shutdown of Asian American engagement in society. People will, like, turn away from our community. But thinking about it, I think it might be the opposite direction. I think, you know, with hate rhetoric and xenophobia surrounding COVID-19 towards Asian Americans, I think it'll drive people to be more politically involved. It will start movements demanding better representation of Asians or protection against hate bias in America for Asian Americans. Will really put our response in the forefront of the public eye. Because, I mean, one of the biggest issues from before, like, racism and xenophobia against Asian Americans has always existed. It's not a new thing, but it's never been at the forefront of the public attention. And so, even though this is like a really scary time that we're living in, hopefully by more coverage of it, by more people talking about it, it'll get our community better represented in the larger media, the larger public, so that way we can get something going and have better representation, both in general discourse and hopefully in politics too.
All right. I'm down. I'm so down.
And I really was, and I'm still so excited by the idea of Asians and Asian Americans being on the forefront of the media and politics. I mean, could this really be possible with ethical representation? But before we can think about saving the world and making social change happen, we have to go back to our original question. What is ethical representation then?
Like most abstract concepts, ethical representation can have multiple definitions, and every person can have a different sense of what it is.
I think ethical representation has to correlate with scientific representation to begin with. People are not viruses, and viruses are not people. We all have viruses in, through, and around us, but viruses are everywhere, right? From a public health standpoint, if you keep calling COVID-19 a Chinese virus, what you're occluding to yourself, the already endemic character of that virus in this place, in this country, in this state, in this county, in this city, in our neighborhood, and so on and so forth. Ethical representation also has to be democratic in the sense that you have to understand that no matter where it comes from, it could go in any direction. It can affect anybody, regardless of class, gender, ethnicity. So far, more of the patients of COVID-19 have been male. We also know that in this country, it has already hit the black population in higher proportions than other ethnicities, right? A democratic representation is also attuned to the populations that are more susceptible.
It speaks to those projects
that are deeply egalitarian and transformative, and in different contexts, radical and revolutionary.
Giving like equal value to different kinds of voices and different ways of thinking, and also valuing different people's contributions.
Something that comes to mind is being able to portray yourself in the way that it's supposed to be, and people being able to perceive it the same way that you portray it.
At its core, ethical representation is I need to feel like my voice, my opinion, what matters to me, my values is being reflected on me. I should see myself in it, and I shouldn't have to like force myself into a box or a label to try to relate to those people.
It's not just about proportional representation.
I think ethical representation means giving people a seat at the table.
It would begin with their investment and their agency, their ownership of the stories that are being told.
What would the world look like if everyone existed, and existed in the truest versions of themselves?
What if everyone and their experiences mattered?
How would this change society, politics, and the economy?
After the stay-at-home orders and travel bans are lifted, could a world like this exist? Ethical representation looks like people having the agency to control their own narrative. When the dominant group in a society creates and imposes narratives on other people, it can be really harmful. Those artificial narratives perpetuate stereotypes, inspire hate crimes, and even cause individuals to develop negative feelings about themselves. That's why it's so important for people to be able to construct their own narratives about their identities and their values. That construction should be a creative, collaborative process that engages personal experience, history, and aspirations for the future.
Ethical representation portrays minorities and marginalized populations with dignity and accuracy. It doesn't invalidate a voice or perspective, but includes them in the narrative that is developed.
It's easy for Asian Americans and Asians to ignore or undermine their experiences. We don't have it as bad as Black people. We don't have it as bad as Latinx individuals. We don't have it as bad as Native Americans in this country. But we also don't exist. And I think in this time when Chinese faces, Asian American faces, and Asian faces are at the forefront, it's crucial that we get to show the face that is ours and exists. That's what ethical representation means.